You're listening to Autumn on the Air, the weekly podcast that brings you conversations about the impact of research commercialization and the people who make it happen. Join us for interviews with patent and licensing professionals, innovators, entrepreneurs, and tech transfer leaders on the issues and trends that matter most. Keep listening for an inside track on the people, IP policies, and politics changing our world.
Welcome to Autumn on the Air. Today we're digging into a policy story with real stakes for every research office and tech transfer shop in the country. A new White House report that proposes rewriting the rules for how the federal government funds science and what supporters and critics alike are saying about it on Capitol Hill. My guest today has spent more than 3 decades explaining to scientists how government actually works. Jeffrey Mervis reports on science policy in the United States and around the world. He keeps a close eye on the changing fortunes of science across the federal government. He also follows efforts to improve science and math education, as well as the factors that shape the U.S. and global scientific workforce. Jeff has reported from 5 continents, including Antarctica, and speaks regularly about the politics of U.S. science to both scientific and lay audiences. He's covered science policy for more than 30 years, including a stint at Nature, and joined Science in 1993. Jeff, welcome to Autumn on the Air. We're really thrilled to have you here on the podcast today.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I'm looking forward to talking with your listeners.
Yeah, we have a lot to talk about, and I thought, Jeff, the best place to kick the podcast off is just to start with basics, particularly for some of our listeners who maybe haven't had the chance to read your article yet. Talk to us, what is Science: A New Golden Age? Talk to us about who wrote it, and why did it land on the very day that Michael Kratsios, who's the director of Office of Science and Policy, ended up testing before the House Science Committee?
Sure, those are good questions, and context is important in understanding how Washington works. So this report is modeled after a report that Vannevar Bush, senior official at MIT, wrote for President Franklin Roosevelt as World War II was ending. The idea was to lay out a vision for American science in the postwar era. The report is called The Endless Frontier, and it has become famous because that phrase has sort of been embraced by the community as an indication of what the relationship between the federal government and academia should be. So 80 years later, Trump gets elected to a second term. He nominates and gets confirmed Michael Kratsios as director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and the president's science advisor. Kratsios, by the way, served in Trump's first term. So he's familiar with how the president thinks. And he, by all accounts, writes a letter that he sends to Trump asking the president to ask him to lay out a new vision for American science. And being the Trump administration, of course, it has to be called the Golden Age. And so Kratsios produces, it takes about a year, produces this report, which at the beginning praises the Bush endless frontier, but then pivots and says, well, it actually has never been fulfilled, and here is our vision. As far as the timing, some people thought, well, this was presented, this was released 16 hours before a scheduled hearing by the House Science Committee, which was a standard oversight hearing on the 2027 budget request. At the same time, some people, including one veteran, Capitol Hill staffer says it actually may have been the other way around. Rather than trying to catch the committee by surprise, it may have been Kratsios may have used the hearing to get the report out, because sometimes reports like this take months to get through vetting and clearance. And he may have said, well, look, I'm going before Congress tomorrow. I want to have something. In either case, that's where the report originated. And we can go from there about what it says.
Yeah, and I'm curious, how do you think that this report relates to some of the other executive orders and agency actions, like we've seen canceling of grant funds, which we're going to talk a lot about? How do you think this all relates with what's been going on since Trump's new term started?
Yeah, no, it's definitely hand in glove. It's an attempt to sort of rationalize what the executive orders say and put them in a larger framework and say, we're not just criticizing woke research. We're not just attacking universities. We're not just saying that the government needs to spend its money differently. It's all part of this new golden age of science.
Yeah, and speaking of that, you mentioned Bush's report, and one of the aspects of Bush's report was it helped to create the NSF and the postwar University Federal Research Partnership. You wrote that this new report would abandon one of Bush's key legacies, which was the central role of universities. So given what you've read in the report and what it says, what do you think this means in practice? Because the report talks about prioritizing individual scientists over legacy institutions.
Yeah, well, that last idea is something that is very confusing to people, and it's not even clear what the White House means by it. On the one hand, of course, science is done by individuals, but at the same time, it is done by individuals at institutions. In the case of NSF, by and large, academic institutions. And, the days of the gentleman scientist, and it was a gentleman, working, in his, back room are long gone. Any scientist today needs, millions of dollars worth of equipment and facilities. So the idea that you can find individual scientists without the institutions is, I don't know, you could call it rhetorical device. Maybe. I think it's partly stems from the fact that this administration seems so hostile to universities that any chance it gets to say, well, we're not going to give the money to universities, it sort of takes advantage of that.
Yeah, and one of the things I got from the report is it definitely talks about how the U.S. research system has become increasingly calcified. And I'm curious, this is a topic you cover science and universities and research in your reporting day to day. Is this something that you think researchers across the political spectrum recognize and agree with, or do you think this is something that is highly contested?
Yeah, well, I don't know if everyone would agree with the word calcify, but I think there's broad consensus that we can do better, that the government needs to find new ways to support academic research, and that academic institutions need to do a better job as stewards of federal dollars. I think that's something that you can get bipartisan support on. And of course, this report comes as the latest in a series of similar reports by groups across the political spectrum, ranging from AAAS and A Vision for American Science and Technology to the Heritage Foundation and a Blueprint 2025. Both those reports obviously are written by different people with different political philosophies and for different purposes, but they both say we need a 2.0 endless frontier. I think that's sort of the shorthand. And I think that's why Kretsios starts with that, because he wants to be seen as coming out of that mainstream, as opposed to just saying nothing that we've done in the past is any good. We have to start from, a blank page.
Yeah, and I want to go back to the funding aspect because the report's very clear. It says that the goal would be to reduce funding to the nation's leading universities and shift it towards teams of scientists working on a series of grand challenges. And for me personally, when I read it, I was kind of like, well, how would this work? Do you have any sense how this reallocation might work practically?
So there's a couple, I think, key elements in that. One is sort of the cost of research itself, and we'll get into that in a minute. The other is the idea that the government needs to sort of set priorities, whether you call them grand challenges or something else. Now, starting with the second, the irony, of course, is that we have no shortage of mission agencies. We have a Department of Energy. We have NASA. We have the National Institutes of Health, and so on, and NIST, NOAA. And all of those agencies have very specific missions. So you could call them grand challenges. The Department of Energy is supposed to make sure that the U.S. is energy independent and do science that furthers, work in that field, and so on for NASA, and the same with NASA and NIH. NSF is unique in not being a mission agency. Its mission is to support basic research that may or may not have commercial applications. So it's a little bit of a non sequitur to say we need to have a mission. We can't just let scientists do their own thing, give them money and get out of the way. That has never been true. Even at NSF, it certainly hasn't been true at any mission agency. The other component, the first thing I mentioned, has to do with the cost of doing the research. And that gets to this sort of fundamental belief by the Trump administration that universities are ripping off the government through, let's call it indirect costs, F&A, whatever you want to use, overhead. And they make these comparisons that don't really hold up to, foundations only charge 8 or 10%, and industry doesn't charge that, although most industries actually charge a lot more, as I'm sure your listeners know. But the idea is sort of ingrained in everything this administration does with regard to funding research. And I think to a certain extent, the public agrees with that because it doesn't understand what that money actually is. Overhead sounds like something you can do without. So I think the community for the last couple of years has struggled to try to come up with a better approach. And the group that Kelvin Drogemeyer led to come up with a new model is an example of that. Obviously, we could say a lot more about that, but I think those are the two important drivers of this idea that we have to do things differently. A third element, I guess, has to do with this industry itself. And that is, again, something that your listeners deal with every day. Partnerships is not a new idea. Public-private partnerships is certainly something that's been going on for a long, long time. Again, this administration, I think, takes that to the next level and says, Well, actually, we would prefer, I think, that industry do most of the research, even with federal dollars, and but at least do most of the applied research, and that the government should basically fund research that is too far away to have any immediate commercial impact.
So do you get the sense that this is going to be redirecting funds towards these grand challenges, or do you think it'll be new funds that'll be directed that way? I kind of get the sense that it'll be redirecting existing funds. Is that kind of your view as well?
Yeah, well, the old adage that there's no such thing as new money is true, except if Congress appropriates more. Now, what's different again about this administration is even when Congress appropriates a certain amount of money, the administration in effect has said, well, that's fine, but the executive branch has the authority to spend that money differently, even aside from not spending it. If you're going to give an agency X billion dollars, then we're going to use that money for our priorities, even if Congress puts directives that says you have to give this program so much and you cannot shift money from one pot to another by more than a certain percentage, or that you can't fund certain types of research. The money is there. So I think people are slowly realizing that the original approach that the Trump administration took, which is just to slash budgets. They're going to cut NSF by 56%. They're going to cut NIH. They're going to cut NASA. Congress didn't go along with that. It is unlikely to go along with that, in the future. So what they're doing instead is saying, well, okay, we've got this pot of money. Here's how we're going to spend it. And, I guess to put it bluntly, they're saying, and if you don't like it, take us to court one way or another.
Yeah, like so many other agencies and people have done for a variety of different things. And I wonder, listening to that, what do you think this means for early and mid-career researchers who've built their careers so far around kind of this traditional grant model? I mean, we've already seen reductions in the number of PhD students being admitted to PhD programs. I kind of wonder what's going to happen to some of these early and mid-career researchers.
Yeah, well, no, it's a good question. And I think you're right to be concerned. Again, this administration has sort of followed conflicting policies with regard to training the next generation of scientists and engineers. On the one hand, Golden Age report talks a lot about how important it is to have a trained workforce, and they often mean an AI-capable workforce, but however you want to describe it. And they give at least lip service to the need to provide enough money for NSF graduate research fellowships, just as one example. At the same time, they have restricted issuing visas and immigration to such an extent that the graduate programs in the U.S., I think, are looking at, the reality that those students, the numbers of students that want to come or that are able to come, willing and able, is dropping because of the policies of the Trump administration that have nothing to do with science, but that have everything to do with a free flow of talent around the world. So those are in opposition to one another. So it's hard to say, well, the administration wants to do X, when sometimes it seems like they want to do A and not A at the same time.
And your article pointed out one of the really interesting aspects of this idea behind this new golden age of science, and that's this regranting. It's a very novel, interesting idea, but obviously it's pretty contested. And the idea would be that federal grant recipients would be able to redistribute money to individuals or organizations who might have better ideas but don't have the infrastructure to win a grant directly. So who's floating this idea, and what do you think that means for some of our listeners' normal roles as institutional grant recipients?
Yeah. So the interesting thing about the regranting is that it comes from the left side of the political spectrum. It comes from progressive groups, and it's been applied to the kind of programs that this Trump administration is traditionally very opposed to. So these are things like arts organizations, rather than a big foundation in New York saying we're going to give a $10 million grant to some nonprofit to do whatever. The idea of regranting is the mother organization gives the money, and then the recipient says, well, the people in the grassroots are really the ones who know best. Let's stay with the, example of music or art. And so we're going to ask the people actually doing the music or the art who the most deserving people are. They don't have access to that big foundation in New York, but they have access to a state or a regional arts council. And so we're going to trust them to spend that money, most efficiently. So the idea in research would be that you would find institutions that would then be altruistic enough to say, well, we don't have all the answers. We're going to subcontract, in effect, with people, including individual scientists or organizations. And they are going to then allocate the money. It's, in one way, a very elitist idea. It's the idea that, well, individuals know best how to spend the money rather than an organization. But it's also a very sort of democracy-based idea in that, it appeals to the Trump administration, I think, because it's consistent with the Washington doesn't know best. The local officials know better. But as I said, so far it's normally been used really with progressive and liberal organizations.
Now, during the hearing, Representative April McLean Delaney told the committee that universities can't be ignored. And I quote, she said, they couldn't do their jobs without the infrastructure available to them on campus. So I'm curious about your view. Do you think there is a real risk that campus research infrastructure, and here we're talking about things like the labs, the compliance offices, the shared facilities that tech transfer offices help fund and build, do you think these things will get squeezed out as federal dollars move towards this whole mission-driven, grand challenges research type of organizations?
Yeah, I think there is certainly a danger of that. And again, the group that Kelvin runs that came up with this model FAIR, which I don't think has gotten very much traction. But the issue is not going to go away. And we are seeing that OMB in particular and federal agencies more broadly are going to keep coming back to propose new ways of limiting indirect costs, limiting overhead. The administration tried and failed last year by doing it agency by agency. The court said you can't do that. It violates all kinds of laws and regulations. So then OMB, in issuing its proposed changes to the federal financial assistance, said, we're not going to touch that issue here, but stay tuned. We're definitely going to come back to it. And I think, again, it's inevitable that this administration, as part of its broader effort to both limit support for universities, get Washington out of, the business of allocating money, whether you call it block grants or indirect cost or something else. So, yes, I think that's a threat. And to the extent that institutions fund offices like tech transfer and other services through the F&A mechanism, it's something that I think is going to become, very tenuous.
So Delaney raised another concern, too, that I want to ask you about. She said that funding a broader range of performers could let the administration allocate dollars based on a grantee's political connections rather than the quality of science, and that a controversial OMB rule change on federal spending management could codify that. How seriously do you think university TTOs should take that concern?
Right. I think they should take it seriously because, again, the overarching principle here is the administration's insistence that the executive branch has unlimited authority to oversee anything that an executive branch agency does. So with respect to research institutions, again, take NSF or NIH as an example, that goes to deciding which grants are most meritorious and should be given federal dollars. Everyone agrees if it's federal dollars, you have to be responsible stewards. Where this administration has gone in a different direction is saying, well, people who are loyal to us and understand our priorities are in the best position to make sure that that money is being spent appropriately and that waste, fraud, and abuse is not permitted. I mean, that was the whole impetus for DOGE. It was a crude but very aggressive, attempt to impose the will of the administration on every federal agency, whether it was terminating grants, suspending grants, firing people, changing the process of how they do business. All of that was considered part of the purview of the new administration and ultimately the president. And so what OMB is saying is, well, that should apply to any recipient of federal assistance. And it's not just research, of course. There's trillions of dollars in all kinds of domestic discretionary spending that is affected by these rules. Yes, and again, even if Congress says, well, you can't implement them immediately, and that's the language that the Senate has put into the continuing resolution, it doesn't prohibit them forever. And even if it did, it would only last until the next appropriation cycle. So, yes, that's another thing that's certainly going to come back. It may take a slightly different form, but the idea that Trump-appointed officials should have the final say is ingrained in this administration.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes to some of the alternatives that they're proposing for peer review in terms of, as we've been talking about, choosing what gets funded. So talk to us about what some of these leading proposals are and what some of the critics say is going to get lost if agencies move away from investigator-led peer-reviewed grants as the default.
Yeah, well, again, there's this Schedule PC, which used to be called Schedule F. I think it stands for political career. And it's the idea that some cadre, it's several thousand, but it's not clear how many, should be spread throughout the government so that they can intervene when appropriate. And of course, that's the sticky issue for an agency like NSF or NIH that relies on peer review. At what point does that political appointee step in? Does he or she do it at the beginning of the process when the applications come in? Do they screen out certain proposals if they have the wrong words or if they're not aligned with the administration's priorities, which is a favorite phrase? Or do they do it informing the peer review panels? Do they make sure that certain views are represented and other views are not representative? Do they do it after the peer review panel meets and recommends that this proposal get funded? Do they do it after the agency recommends funding and it's signed off on? Or do they even do it retrospectively after the award has been made on the grounds that we have to terminate this award because it doesn't align with administration priorities? So at every point along that spectrum, there is the opportunity for mischief or worse.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, your article noted that the report emphasizes the physical sciences at the expense of other disciplines, spending more on things like AI, which we've heard the administration talk a lot about, quantum, fusion, space, semiconductors, and robotics. So for some of our listeners who are from large biomedical institutions or even TTOs that have large life science portfolios, what do you think they should read into this rebalancing?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that Golden Age report draws this distinction between the life sciences and the biological sciences. And again, I don't think the community knows what that means, or I'm not sure the administration knows what it means. But in a practical sense, I think what they're saying is biomedical sciences are things that are directly focused on health, and that's on fundamental processes. But life sciences get into treatment and application, and that's where the administration is much more suspicious of the research establishment. Vaccines is obviously the perfect example. And so that's, I think, what they consider to be life sciences, and therefore should be de-emphasized because that's not fundamental science. That gets into policy and political judgments.
And I want to ask you about a statement that Kayvon Stassen, who's an astrophysicist from Vanderbilt University, who was recently removed from NSF's oversight board, he has made some comments on this report, and he said it's all motherhood and apple pie on the surface, but underneath is a vision for faster technology development and commercialization, while underinvesting in the fundamental research, expert peer review, and scientific workforce that makes all those advances possible. I'm curious, in all your work on studying this report and talking to people out there, does your reporting support that read, or is there a stronger case for the commercialization emphasis that the critics maybe are giving this for?
Yeah, well, I think Kayvon is making 2 points. So the first one is the motherhood and apple pie, and that has to do with, again, what the administration has dubbed gold standard science. This feeds into the golden age of science. And most of those principles, again, are things that every scientist would say are important, whether reproducibility, accuracy, transparency, and so on down the line. Few people could object to that. So again, the administration is starting from a premise that it feels is mainstream. But then the way it applies those principles is where the controversy begins. To his second point is, even if you accept that those principles are non-political, apolitical maybe is a better way to say it, the administration is saying the goal should be faster commercialization. And I think a lot of researchers say, well, again, that's fine, but you can't start with faster commercialization as a grant proposal. You have to start with the fundamental science and the processes, whether they're chemical, biological, physical, that underlie what is going to eventually turn into MRI or eventually turn into a COVID vaccine.
And sometimes those things take 10, 15 years of research before you finally get to something that's even commercializable.
Right. Or 20 or 40 years.
40 years. Yeah, exactly. And I want to turn and talk about the hearing a little bit because it was very, very interesting in terms of some of the perspectives that came out. First, you had committee chair Brian Babin, who called the hearing a needed refocus on excellence, accountability, and outcomes. And in contrast, you had Zoe Lofgren, who called the hearing's title Unleashing the Golden Age of Science, stunningly ironic given the cuts already underway. So how much of the debate do you think is about the substance of the report versus what's happened over the last 18, 19 months in terms of grant terminations, firings, and budget cuts at NIH and NSF that have preceded all of this?
Yeah. Well, I think it's just the second, because for a couple of reasons. One, every congressional hearing is a show. It's being held to make a particular point. And traditionally, the House Science Committee has been bipartisan. And even now, they still vote out dozens of bills that authorize programs and that authorize spending. And I know your listeners understand the difference between authorization and appropriations. So they can get agreement on lots of things, from earthquake hazards to commercial space to, quantum, even training, education programs. But what was going on in this hearing was reflecting what's happened in the last 18 months. And there's a complete partisan divide. There are no Democrats on the committee who support any Trump spending proposals or executive orders. And the Republicans had been pretty much silent. They haven't made comments about any of those orders or any of those budgets other than to say, we support President Trump, and it's part of a broader attempt to, make the government more efficient and eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. So again, that's what you saw going on at the hearing. Chairman Babin and the other Republicans, offered softball questions to Kratsios to give him a chance to explain his vision and the president's priorities. And the Democrats, hammered away at what they saw as the blatant contradictions between the rhetoric in the report and the reality of the budget proposals and the executive orders. And there was no common ground.
It's not a big surprise given the environment like we've been talking. And, the report that we've been talking about also comes, and I think you alluded to this, a companion budget priorities memo that's tied to fiscal 2028 year request. And agencies have 90 days to submit implementation plans. What do you think the timetable might be for any of this in terms of this report becoming real policy versus it just remaining aspirational?
Yeah. Well, I think actually this administration does put its policies into effect. I mean, it's aspirational goals. So the short answer to your question is yes, we will almost certainly see in the 2028 president's budget request a continued emphasis on what's in the report, Golden Age. And that's spelled out in this memo, which comes out every year in July or August. And it's basically a way for OMB to remind agencies that this is the framework, and what you submit to us next month when the budget process begins needs to emphasize these priorities, because otherwise we're going to cut it out of the budget request that you submitted. Yes, it does reflect what they want to do, but at the same time, there were no surprises. There's nothing new that the administration and OMB haven't said many, many times before, and save for Kratsios in the speeches that he's given, whether he's at the National Academy or whether he's at the National, Association of Manufacturers or an AI conference. He emphasizes the same points, and those are reinforced in this memo.
Now, the report also calls for opening national labs to industry more broadly, as well as streamlining CRADA's licensing and other transaction authority. Do you think if that happens, does it help, or does it compete with university tech transfer offices who are trying to move these discoveries from the universities out into industry to get them into their hands as quickly as possible?
Well, I've been covering national science policy for a long time, and I think every administration has said we have to reform the national labs. We have to integrate them into our research system. We have to make them more efficient, whether it's CRADAs or internships or whatever. These are crown jewels. They have tremendous facilities, but they're not being used to their greatest advantage. So I haven't seen anything from the Trump administration that's significantly different in terms of how to interact with the national labs. So I'm not sure that there's anything new that your audience is going to have to worry about. I think Dario Gil, as the Undersecretary for Science at the Department of Energy, is familiar with all these issues. But as far as I'm aware, he hasn't come up with a dramatically new way of operating the labs or, having them interact with the other sectors of the research enterprise.
I also want to ask you about SBIR and STTR funding, because the proposal wants to redirect that funding towards strategic capabilities and scale up industry-sponsored PhDs and postdocs that pull talent out of the traditional academic pipeline. So what do you think a university tech transfer office and maybe even the research administration teams should be doing now to adapt to that shift if it happens?
Yeah, again, I'm not sure that there's going to be a significant shift. I mean, the SBIR program, just to use that since it's much larger than STTR, has been around for 45 years. I've always found it interesting that the research community, especially the biomedical community, has historically been suspicious of that program because they feel that it's somehow lower quality science, even though there's been any number of reports from the Academy and other groups showing that that isn't the case. But beyond that, I think it's a small but important part of the larger research enterprise. So I don't think changes to SBIR and STTR by itself are going to significantly require universities to operate significantly different.
Now, Jeff, if you were in a briefing room with a bunch of folks from tech transfer offices, what's the one thing in this report you would tell them to watch the most closely over the next 6 or so months?
Yeah, well, again, I think it comes down to money. To the extent that their offices are supported institutionally, as opposed to through licensing agreement or, patent revenue or other things, if universities are getting less money, they're getting fewer grants, they're getting, reductions in indirect costs, they are going to be directly affected. And again, it may seem contradictory for the administration to want to do that when it emphasizes tech transfers so heavily, but I think that's the short-term reality.
So, Jeff, as the podcast comes to a close, before I let you go, I wanted to ask you one last question. For our listeners who want to follow this story as it continues to develop over the next few months, in addition to following your reporting, where else should they be looking to help stay ahead of this?
Well, I think they want to look at individual announcements, solicitations, as they always have from agencies, because there's been a lot of turmoil, in particular at NSF, but also at other agencies, about delays in having those solicitations. So I think that's something to keep an eye on. And related element, to the extent that it affects their operations, is the whole issue of cost sharing. This is a chronic debate about whether that disadvantages institutions with fewer resources. But I think this administration is pretty committed to saying, well, you guys need to share the load. And so I think those two things are things that they should be tracking.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for your in-depth reporting on this and for spending some time with us today to walk through the report in detail. We look forward to your continued reporting and staying in touch on this issue. It's so important for our listeners. Thank you so much again.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity, and best of luck.
Jeff, this has been an incredibly clarifying conversation. You've given us a clear roadmap through a genuinely complicated document, from the pivot away from universities and toward individual scientists, to the funding mechanisms replacing peer review, to what all of this could mean for the tech transfer offices trying to plan around it. For our listeners, we'll include links in the show notes to Jeff's original science article, the full White House report, and the fiscal 2028 budget's priority memo, so you can read the primary sources for yourself. If your institution's research portfolio leans heavily on the traditional grant model, consider this episode your signal to start watching the fiscal year 2028 budget requests closely. Thank you, Jeff, for the clarity and rigor you bring to this beat every week. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. If you found this episode valuable, please share it with colleagues in your office. This has been Autumn on the Air. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next week.
Thanks for listening to Autumn on the Air with Lisa Mueller. Get social with us and share your thoughts. You can tweet us at AUTM or visit us online at autm.net. We'll be back next week on the air. Be sure to join us.